So you want to know if you're doing a good job, right? You can't really do a good job unless you know what the standards are. And while we could talk about what good writing means to a whole lot of people, let's face it, you're in my class now. So what do I want? Other than a good life. When I read student writing, I have some very specific things I look for. First off, and absolutely the most important, and probably the word you'll hear me say more than anything else this semester, is argument. It's all about argument. Evidence/proof, structure/organization, and then mechanics and grammar. This is in descending order. Argument's most important, the other things less so, but we'll talk about how it all fits in. Let's break down the argument bit. First, let's get a certain amount of terminology so we know exactly what we're talking about, because argument isn't just people yelling at each other. An argument is a claim backed by reasons that are supported by evidence. So, what's a claim? A claim is a statement about what is true or good or about what should be done or believed. Yeah, it seems a little bit wishy-washy, but this is probably as accurate as we get right now. The more sample writing we go through, the clearer this is going to become. Reasons are statements of support for claims. Evidence is support for the reasons offered, whether you're talking data, statistics, quote, whatever. This is all adapted from the University of Pittsburgh. The Department of Communication had a page that defined all these things, and it's about as good as I've seen online. I could probably come up with better myself, but let's give other people credit too. Now, let's take these one by one. Requirements for a good argument. For an argument to be good, it has to fit these three requirements. First off, reasonable differences must be possible. Secondly, the argument must be plausible. And third, the argument must be shareable. And don't worry, we're going to take these all one by one. But let's start off with the reasonable differences. When we're talking reasonable differences, let's do an example. If we're interested in history, say the history of combat, we can make an argument about World War II. But if I said, America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, not that Pearl Harbor, this Pearl Harbor, that's not really a great argument. It's boring as hell. Not to say Pearl Harbor is boring, but saying America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor is something on which you're not going to find anyone who's going to be able to disagree. And if no one disagrees, it's pretty much assumed to be a fact. We're not just yelling facts at each other. That's not really what argument is about. If we were interested in history and wanted a better argument, we could make an argument based on the question of what led to World War I. This is a little bit more nebulous. The answer that you always get in school is that it was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which never really struck me as a great explanation. One guy gets shot, even a fairly high-up guy. How does that lead to a world war? Well, the next explanation that people tend to give is it was because there are a lot of interlocking treaties. Person A made a treaty with person B that if they get attacked, person B will help them, and so on and so forth. And when you map out these treaties, you get some really interesting, weird stuff happening that, yeah, it kind of divides itself to opposing sides, but then you get people like Bulgaria and Serbia who are playing both camps. The problem with the treaties, though, is it doesn't explain why everybody had these interlocking treaties. If you talk to World War I experts, you're going to hear a lot of different possibilities for causes. Some of the factors involve nationalism, French revenge against Germany, French desire for Alsace and Lorraine, Pan-Slavism in Eastern Europe, and so on and so forth. And the era before World War I was really a rise in nationalism. Germany hadn't really been a country all that long, but there was already conflict between Germany and a lot of other people. Imperialism. there was lots of concern about various countries growing empires, and empires equaled financial gain. So if this person's empire grows, it's going to cut into my business. Growing militarism, and there was an increase in militarism at the time. All these things led to the alliances. Let's look at something in a bit more depth. The imperialism thing, it's really hard to underestimate the importance of imperialism, and a lot of World War I scholars will point this out as probably the dominant cause. Africa was, unfortunately, owned and fought over by pretty much everybody except for the Africans, who didn't really get much of a voice in how their own continent was being run. And it was creeping into Southeast Asia, Japan, India, Australia, into China, Indochina, a lot of the islands there too. This was the source of income for these empires. The reason the British were such a large empire wasn't because they had great wealth in England, it's because they had great wealth all over the world. And Germany wanted to gain more of an imperial footprint so they could get more money coming in to support their claims. And this is just one of them. We could talk about religious differences. We could talk about ethnic differences. This is just one possible cause. If we want to talk about another possible cause, we could talk about ethnic and nationalist differences. We can also talk about the different ethnic groups involved, and nationalism is an issue, which gets really complex because one of the major players in World War I was the Austria-Hungary Empire, which you see covered a lot of different countries, and there was a lot of ethnic groups within this country. So there's a large ethnic and nationalistic component to the battle to begin with. Which one of these is the right answer? Well, this is the fun thing, because when you talk to World War I scholars, there's still a lot of debate and disagreement. There are a lot of places for you to carve out your own, this is the proper answer, and this is why all the other answers are wrong. And that's kind of what we do in academics. So, reasonable differences. The second requirement of arguments is that the argument must be plausible. It has to be viable. It has to be possible within the realm of reason. Say I make an argument about Pokemon. Pokemon isn't just a cartoon. Pokemon is real. See? They're real. And my personal favorite Pokemon, who I probably emulate more than any others, Snorlax is real. Well, the thing is, you know as well as I do that this is just on its face a ridiculous kind of argument to be made. Pokemon aren't real, it's a fiction, and you could trace the fictive roots. If you don't think about the examples and the evidence in more detail, it's easy to get confused because particularly with the advent of things like Photoshop and artificial intelligence contributing to more realistic evidence, you can't just rely on what you see. You have to interrogate everything to see if the argument is something that makes sense. Not just it looks like it might make sense. Does it really make sense? Does it follow the rules of logic and rationality? Things we'll be talking about later. And the argument must also be shareable. What we mean by shareable is that it can't be just something that bounces in your own head. Other people have to be able to see the argument legitimately and have a legitimate position. I can't say that, say, Amy Mann is the best songwriter ever. There are people who will agree with me on that one, but it's hard to prove these things. I can't say that I'm secretly a centaur without proof. I can't say that the Superman movie in 2025 was the best comic book movie ever. I can't say that I'm secretly a monarch. These things are all claims that don't translate well to other people because they reek of personal opinion. So what are the warning signs that you're thinking about an argument that isn't shareable? Well, there's a few of them. Assessment. Is this an argument that's dependent on terms like good or bad? What I think is good isn't going to be something that you think is good. I think Vietnamese food is awesome, but I know people who don't like Vietnamese food. I think they're wrong, but that's not really something I can make an argument about. Is it a value judgment? Is it something that's dependent on my personal belief on what is right, what is wrong? Is there phrase signaling language? Do you see phrases pop up like I think, I feel, I believe? These are all signs that it's a personal thing going on rather than something that can be supported in a logical, rational, and evidence-based way. Is it dependent on a personal perspective, something that only I can see or only the author can see? Or is the existence of supporting evidence just not really possible? Arguments have to be something that can survive in the public sphere. Yeah, they can start with your own thoughts, but if you can't prove them in a way that makes sense to other people, and if no one can ever agree with you, then you're not really doing argument. You're doing something else. The next thing I look for in terms of categories for good papers is evidence and proof. Now, you're going to get some access to library resources as we go along, and we'll talk about that kind of stuff later. But I do want to talk about what makes good evidence, because there are a lot of different kinds of evidence. So what are the requirements for good evidence? Well, the author has to write from a position of authority. It can't just be some dude. The content has to be reviewed by experts and is generally considered accurate and fair. It can't just be something someone made up in the middle of the night. The source that the information comes from has to be current and reflect the state of knowledge in the field. So let's deal with these one by one. Authority. Say I wanted to know something about professional football. I could go and ask LeBron James. But is LeBron James knowledgeable about professional football? He might be, I don't know. But he's far from an authority figure on professional football. He's a basketball player. You can't always just assume that someone is an authority or not. You have to do some level of research to find out for sure, though. Sometimes you might end up in weird circumstances. You know the actor George Clooney? There's always a lot of talk on whether you can consider actors to be legitimate voices of political thoughts and ideals. And George Clooney probably can't talk a lot about a lot of issues, but George Clooney has also been heavily involved in Sudanese rights. Him and Don Cheadle used to fund satellites which studied Sudan and Darfur specifically for human rights abuses. So he might know a little bit more about that than you'd expect. Do the research and find out whether someone is a legitimate authority or not. Whether the evidence comes from a legitimate source that has been reviewed so we know the information is accurate. Anybody can build a web page, and just because there's a web page doesn't mean that the information in there is going to be good. Anybody can post to social media, and that doesn't mean that that information is going to be good. It doesn't necessarily mean that all web pages and all social media stuff is bad, but there's not really any bar to clear there. I can post the most outrageous, wacky things, like Pokemon are real on FacePage, Twitter book, or whatever, and unless it gets hit by an algorithm and flagged as inaccurate, which doesn't really happen all that much, someone might see it and think it's real, so you have to be skeptical. Look for better sources of information. The U.S. National Science Foundation probably has a bit more accurate stuff than I'm going to find on Instagram. You can go a step further and go to academic journals, and they're going to be, particularly if it's a peer-reviewed journal, that's going to provide that much more certainly well-reviewed information. You can go to an academic book, which is also going to be very reviewed, very detailed, very trustworthy information. Not always, but most frequently. The difference between a book and a journal is a journal isn't going to be as well reviewed as a book, but it's going to be more current. When you get to an academic book, there are more sets of eyes that make sure everything is good, so it's going to be more double dog sure correct, but it's not going to be as fast. A good mix of each. Now let's talk about information being current. No, not currents. Current. No, not current as an electrical current. I mean current as... How the heck with it? Some fields move very fast. If we're talking about technology, technology tends to move frightfully fast. The first commercial mobile phone was 1983. If I'm writing something about commercial technology, I'm not using sources from 1983. I'm not using sources from 2003 where the Ericsson Z1010 had the first front-facing camera. I think I might have had one of those. I also had one of the Nokias. It wasn't one with the anyway. Technology moves very, very fast, so even if I'm using just something from 5 years ago as a source about technology, it's not going to reflect what's current now. Lots of fields are this way. For instance, medical stuff, you want medical stuff to be very, very current, and the medical field tends to move fairly fast now. What was a cutting-edge treatment 10 years ago isn't what's cutting edge now. Even the rapid development of cancer treatment, of vaccines, has happened a lot in the last 5 or 6 years. What we can do now in those fields is a lot different than what we could do then. So if I'm looking for a source of medical information from 2018, it's probably not going to be trustworthy. If a field moves fast, you want current. Current information is going to be better. Let's now talk about structure and organization. Academic essays are very structured and have a fairly rigid set of standards shaping how we present information. We can't do it willy-nilly. As a friend of mine said, we're not writing murder mysteries. We don't want to wait until the end to figure out what the claim is. So it's probably better to tie your writing closer to the structure than not. And this is one of the things I look for. I expect to see a good introduction, good body paragraphs, and a good conclusion. The introduction needs to do specific things. It needs to hook the reader, grab the reader's attention. It needs to introduce the subject of analysis. If I don't know what it is after reading your first couple paragraphs, you're in trouble. It needs to clearly state the thesis, and an academic writing that's at the end of the introduction, and a clear thesis statement, something we'll talk about more later. Then you have body paragraphs, and the body paragraphs have specific roles too. Each paragraph is one point in support of the larger argument. You start each paragraph with a topic sentence, which clearly states what role this paragraph is doing supporting the larger argument. You then, in each paragraph, provide specific evidence for each claim, and you explain how that evidence supports the claim. And you use as many paragraphs as you need. You probably have been taught the 5-paragraph model at some point in your education, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you shouldn't limit yourself to 3 body paragraphs. You take as many as you need. Then you go to a conclusion where you're supposed to restate the thesis and give me a call to action. The other things I look for in papers is significance. I want to know why I'm reading this and what the importance is. And as the paper progresses, particularly near the end of the paper, is where you should be dealing very explicitly with why this is important. Also, the level of detail. Academic writing, you want to start out specific and move towards general. I want to be focused in on detail, particularly at the beginning. As a reader, I can picture stuff that's done in detail, but if you're talking big, broad, and general, I have a harder time. But if you set up your big, broad, and general stuff with your specific analysis, it works a little bit better. Now, mechanics and grammar are the last of the 4 things I look for, and we're not going to beat this one too much. Grammar is important, but grammar is mostly important because if I can't understand what's going on at a particular point, I can't follow your argument. I'm only going to give you one example here. This is from a paper I saw about some new method. This is from a paper I saw online about a new method of propulsion for interstellar and interplanetary travel. I don't know much about that, but I know writing, and look at this opening sentence. A new principle of electric propulsion for spacecraft is introduced using microwave technology to achieve direct conversion of DC power to thrust without the need for propellant. The next sentence doesn't get any better. A simplified illustrative description of the principles of operation is given, followed by the derivation from its first principles of an equation for the thrust from such a device. The implication of the law of conservation of energy are examined for both static and dynamic operation of the device. I have no idea what they're talking about. And it's not just because I don't know the subject. Even if I knew the subject, this is language that's very hard to parse. And if I'm spending all my time struggling on the language, I'm not spending time figuring out the argument. Argument's important. It's all about argument in the end. Doesn't matter what field you're talking about in college, your job is to come up with a good interpretation of what's happening, a good explanation, something like that, and communicate it to your audience. So it's not reciting facts, it's you arguing your position. Argument is everything. The two things you need to know about how I'm going to approach your stuff, beyond what we've just talked about, is that I'm going to read your writing from a stupidly literal perspective and a stupidly critical perspective. What I mean by that: stupidly literal is that I have to limit myself to what you actually write in the papers. I can't assume that you really meant this. I gotta stick to what's on the page, because that's how readers are going to interpret your stuff. You can't count on them connecting the dots, because it's your job to make it clear enough to where they don't have to do that. In terms of stupidly critical, it's not just me trying to be a mean bastard when we're talking about this stuff. Some have claimed I'm a mean bastard. I try not to think about that. Anyway, my job is to help you get better at writing, and we can't really do that if I'm not pointing out what's going wrong. It's also true that when outside people read your stuff, they're not always going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and they're not going to read with the most open interpretation. You can't give them chances to misinterpret stuff. So you got to kind of write as if your reader is going to be critical too, because, well, they're engaged in arguments as well, and they're probably looking for stuff to sink their claws into, argumentatively speaking. We'll talk a lot more about argument as we're together, but I hope this gives you an idea of what the expectations are, at least to start off with. See you in the next video.